All right, diving right in. Today we're taking a look at a world that is both incredibly vast and fascinating, and that's the world of Chinese martial arts.
A world that many people just kind of lump together, but it's so diverse.
Absolutely, right? I mean, we've all heard these terms, Kung Fu, Kuoshu, Wushu, and they all kind of point to this rich history of fighting styles that have developed over, centuries, right?
Yeah.
Across Greater China, as it's known, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. And even those terms themselves, right? Martial arts, national art, martial art, they're all translations of those terms, but you can see how important this is to the history and culture of China.
It's more than just fighting, yeah. So for our listeners today, we're aiming to cut through all this vastness, this history, and pull out the most compelling insights, right? The stuff that's going to make you think, wow, I didn't know that. We've been looking at everything from, Wikipedia, the basics, Wikidoc, to blog posts, even some Reddit threads.
Yeah, you'd be surprised what people are talking about on Reddit, actually.
Oh, yeah, some great stuff there. Some crazy stuff, too. But we're focusing on the good stuff, the insightful, interesting stuff to give you that solid understanding without, completely overloading your brain.
We don't want to make it a college course. This is about enjoying it, learning something new.
Right. So let's get to it. Where did this all begin? I mean, when we look back at the sources, it seems like some pretty basic human needs were at play in ancient China, protecting yourself, obviously, hunting to survive. And I mean, military training has to be a huge part of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. You can't really separate martial arts from the history of warfare.
Right. Makes sense. But it wasn't just about being physically strong and tough. Right. There's more to it than that.
Well, yeah. And what's really interesting is that even in those early stages, you start to see the strategic thinking emerging. I mean, look at the Spring and Autumn Annals from, the 5th century BC. It actually talks about theoretical concepts of hand-to-hand combat.
5th century BC. We're talking ancient history here.
Ancient. But they were already thinking about things like, hard and soft techniques, how those can be used together. Mm-hmm. This idea that there are these opposing but also complementary forces at play. It's something you see throughout Chinese martial arts, even today.
So that concept of yin and yang was already there.
In a way, yeah. You can see the seeds of it, at least. And they even had actual fighting systems way back then.
Really? Like what kind of systems?
Well, there's this thing called Zhuli or Jiaoli mentioned in the Classic of Rites. It sounds like it was pretty comprehensive. It involved grappling, but also strikes, throws, even joint manipulation.
Oh, whoa, joint manipulate. Like what we might think of as pressure points and stuff.
Yeah, very similar. And what's even more interesting? This system eventually evolved into a sport called Jiao Di during the Qin dynasty. So you can see how something that started as a way to, survive on the battlefield eventually became more formalized, even, dare I say, recreational.
I mean, the sports often come from, very practical origins, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And the Han history bibliographies are super interesting, too, because they make this distinction between Shubo, which was essentially weaponless fighting that had, get this, dedicated training manuals, even back then. And they distinguished that from Zhuli, which was considered more of an athletic wrestling sport by that point. So you can see how these two things were developing alongside each other, practical combat skills and more formalized combat.
So even back then, you had people who were training for the street and people who were training for the arena.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And that kind of development continued through different periods in Chinese history. I mean, you have sword dances mentioned in poems from the Tang Dynasty, Xiangku wrestling contests during the Song and Yuan Dynasty. It all kind of led to what we see in the Ming and Qing dynasties, which is when, a lot of the styles and concepts we recognize today really took shape.
Okay, so we're talking about, thousands of years of development here. But it wasn't just about the physical techniques themselves, was it? There seems to be this real philosophical, maybe even spiritual dimension to these arts.
You hit the nail on the head there. I mean, you can't talk about Chinese martial arts without talking about the broader philosophical context.
Right, because it all came from somewhere, right?
Exactly. And a lot of it is tied to, Taoism, for example. You have texts like the Zhuangzi that really dive into the psychology, the mental aspects of practicing martial arts. And the Tao Te Ching, which is the foundational text of Taoism. It has all these principles about balance, harmony, the way of nature. And those ideas are deeply resonant with martial arts philosophy.
I mean, those are themes you see in all kinds of aspects of Chinese culture, right?
Absolutely. And even Confucianism played a role. Archery and charioteering were actually part of the 6 arts that were considered essential for the educated elite during the Zhou dynasty. And those arts emphasize discipline, precision, very much in line with martial arts training.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about fighting prowess, but also about self-cultivation, right?
Yeah, very much so. And even Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is, of course, about military strategy, a lot of the ideas in that book can be applied to martial arts as well. It's about outsmarting your opponent, using your strengths to exploit their weaknesses.
That makes sense. And speaking of self-cultivation, the focus on health and well-being seems to be there from the very beginning, right? I mean, we're talking about Daoin, which is like an early form of Qigong practiced by Taoists as far back as 500 BC. And then you have Huatuo's Five Animals play, which involved mimicking the movements of like a tiger, a deer, a monkey, a bear, and a bird. And that was around 2088. It's amazing to think about.
It is, isn't it? And what's really cool is that these early health practices weren't seen as separate from martial arts training. They were very much intertwined.
So it wasn't just about like fighting. It was about health and longevity too.
Exactly. Daoyin, for example, it involved these specific movements and breathing techniques that were all about cultivating and circulating this energy within the body.
And that's what Kuai is, right? This internal energy, life force, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. And it's a concept that became central to both Qigong and a lot of the internal martial arts styles. Even some styles like Eight Immortals, for example, they directly reference figures from Taoist mythology, and the movements in those styles are meant to embody the characteristics and attributes of those immortals.
So it's like the mythology is woven right into the movements themselves.
In a way, yeah. It's really fascinating how deeply integrated these philosophies and folklores are with the physical practice of martial arts.
All right, so we've got this long history, deep philosophical underpinning, but there are so many different styles out there. How do you even start to make sense of it all? How are these styles typically categorized?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be overwhelming, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, where do you even begin?
Well, there are a few common ways to approach it. One of the most well-known is the distinction between external and internal styles.
Okay, I've definitely heard of that. But remind me, what's the difference?
So external styles, think of like Shaolin Kung Fu, the really famous one. They tend to focus on developing physical attributes like, speed, strength, agility, power. It's about what you can see, the outward expression.
So it's all about being strong and fast and hitting hard.
Yeah, essentially. Internal styles, on the other hand, things like Tai Chi, which is super popular, they focus more on cultivating and manipulating the skala we were talking about.
So it's more about what's going on inside, the unseen energy.
Right. And it's not just about physical power. It's about cultivating a connection between mind, body, and spirit. It's a more holistic approach. This way of categorizing them, it really became popular around the late 17th century, though some martial arts scholars, they still debate about whether it really applies to every single style out there.
Right, because nothing is ever that black and white, right?
You got it.
So are there other ways to group these different martial arts?
Oh, absolutely. Another common way is geographically. You can broadly divide them into northern and southern styles, and the Yangtze River is kind of the rough dividing line.
Okay, so like north of the Yangtze versus south of the Yangtze, what's the difference there?
Well, northern styles tend to be more, I guess you could say, dynamic. They often involve a lot of like fast kicks, high kicks, jumps, leaps, those kinds of things. Some examples would be Changquan, which means long fist, and Jingjiquan, which is a form intention fist, which is kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, try saying that 5 times fast.
Right. Southern styles, on the other hand, tend to focus more on like strong hand techniques, stable stances, intricate footwork. They're not so big on the high kick. Some examples would be Wing Chun, Choi Li Fut, Bok Mei, which means white eyebrow, and Wushu, which is 5 ancestors fit.
So if you're watching a martial arts movie and you see someone doing all these crazy acrobatic kicks and jumps, it's probably a northern style.
That's a good rule of thumb, yeah. But of course, there's always overlap. And these are just general tendencies. You can't always draw such hard lines.
Right. Every style has its own unique flavor.
Exactly. And there are other ways to categorize them too. Some styles are grouped by their religious origins. So you have like Buddhist influenced styles, Taoist influenced styles. Some are named after animal movements, like think of monkey kung fu or praying mantis kung fu. They try to emulate the movements and like fighting spirit of those animals.
Oh yeah, I've seen those. They're pretty cool.
Yeah, they are. And then you have family styles, which have been passed down through generations within a specific family or lineage, like Hung Gar, for example. And ultimately, a lot of experienced martial artists will tell you that most styles, no matter how you categorize them, incorporate a mix of hard and soft elements, which again goes back to that yin and yang philosophy.
So even though we try to put them in these neat little boxes, it's all interconnected in the end.
Pretty much, yeah. It's all about finding that balance.
Okay, so say you've explored all these different styles, you found one that really resonates with you. What would the training actually involve? I mean, it can't just be endless punching and kicking drills, can it?
No, no, not at all. The training is usually very comprehensive. It involves a lot of different elements.
Okay, so walk me through it. What are some of the core components?
Well, you always start with the basics, right? Mastering those fundamental movements and postures. That's the foundation.
Like the building blocks of everything else.
Exactly. Stances are also crucial. You got to have a solid stance to generate power and maintain your balance. And then meditation is often incorporated as well. It's about cultivating focus, mental discipline.
So it's not just about physical strength, it's about mental strength too.
Oh, absolutely. You can't have one without the other. And then there's learning to harness call. That internal energy we talked about. It involves specific breathing and movement techniques. Some people might call it energy cultivation.
So learning to control that inner power.
Right. And then, of course, there's weapons training. Different styles use different weapons, but that's a big part of it.
Swords, staffs, nunchucks, all that cool stuff.
All that good stuff, yeah. And then you have application training, which is basically learning how to use all these techniques in a real-life self-defense situation, how to actually apply what you've learned. And then, of course, there are the forms.
The forms, oh, you mean the choreographed sequences of movements, the ones that almost look like a dance?
Yeah, Taolu, they're called. And they do have a certain aesthetic quality to them, you're right.
They can be really beautiful to watch.
Yeah.
But they're not just about looking pretty.
No, not at all. The forms are designed to embody and transmit real martial technique, but the movements within them, they're not always exactly how you would execute them in a real fight.
So it's like a stylized representation of the techniques.
Right. A lot of the forms have evolved over time, both to enhance combat readiness, but also for performance and demonstration purposes. You know, those really low stances, those high sweeping kicks you see.
Yeah, those look super cool.
They do, but they're not always the most practical in a real fight. They're more about conditioning and visual impact.
Right, you're not going to be doing a spinning jump kick in a street fight, are you?
Probably not, no. But the training is still valuable. And some modern schools, particularly in the realm of Wushu as a sport, they actually emphasize those acrobatic feat in the forms for competitions and exhibitions.
So it's become more about, the performance aspect.
In a way, yeah. And it's led to some debate among, more traditional practitioners. They feel like the focus on acrobatics can sometimes overshadow the core combat applications and principles of the art.
So it's like a bit of a divide between the traditionalists and the modern sport practitioners.
Yeah, you could say that. But the fundamental purpose of forms practice, regardless of how they're performed, is still about developing correct posture, proper breathing, coordination, and the ability to execute techniques fluidly with both sides of the body.
Okay, so the forms are still an important part of the training, even if they've evolved over time.
Absolutely. They're like a living tradition.
Speaking of evolution, let's talk about Wushu. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, sometimes interchangeably with Kung Fu, but it sounds like it has a more specific meaning, especially in the modern context.
Yeah, you're right. It can be a bit confusing. The term Wu itself just means martial. So Wushu literally just means martial art. It's been used for centuries, actually. We see records going back to the Liang dynasty. But in more recent history, especially after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Wushu was actively promoted as a standardized and regulated sport.
Okay, so the government was like, let's make this an official sport.
Pretty much, yeah. And it kind of created this separate thing from the traditional independent family schools and lineages that had existed for so long.
So it became more centralized, less about the individual styles and lineages.
Exactly. Especially during the Cultural Revolution, traditional martial arts practices were sometimes discouraged. The government was trying to create a unified approach, something that could be taught in schools and used in national competition.
Interesting. So it was part of this whole cultural shift that was happening at the time.
Yeah, very much so. But even within this modern Wushu framework, you still have competitive sparring like Sanda, which is also known as Sen. It's basically Chinese kickboxing.
Yeah.
And then there's Shuaijiu, which is a form of Chinese folk wrestling.
So it's not just about forms and demonstration. There's still actual fighting going on.
Oh, yeah, definitely. These disciplines were traditionally contested on these raised platforms called Lai Tai. And Senshu, especially, has become quite popular as a modern combat sport. It's a bit safer and more regulated than some of the traditional forms of fighting. And of course, Chinese martial artists also participate in all kinds of international combat sports like boxing, MMA, things like that.
So it's not just a closed-off world. It interacts with other martial arts traditions.
Absolutely. It's a global phenomenon now.
All right, so beyond the fighting and the sport, it's clear that Chinese martial arts have had this huge impact on Chinese culture as a whole.
You can't really separate them. It's woven into the fabric of the culture.
So how far back does this influence go?
I mean, we're talking centuries here. Martial arts themes have been in Chinese literature for as long as people have been writing. You see it in classic novels like the Chengqiu, the Zhangguosei, the Xu Huzhuan, the Sanguo Yanyi.
Those are some pretty heavy-hitting titles in Chinese literature.
Oh, absolutely. They're foundational texts. And even though some of the stories involve, fantastical elements like the legendary King Gong, the art of lightness that supposedly allows people to, fly through the air, those stories have really shaped cultural values, heroes, ideals.
So it's like these martial arts stories became part of the national mythos.
Yeah, in a way. And in modern China, it's almost used as a symbol of national strength and character. You see figures like Ip Man and Hu Yuanji celebrated as national heroes.
Yeah, those names are pretty iconic, especially thanks to all the movies that have been made about them.
Right. They represent resilience, national pride, certain moral virtues, and you see martial arts practiced by everyday people for health benefits, especially older adults, doing Tai Chi in the park, practicing sword waving.
Yeah, it's become almost like a cultural institution, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And then, of course, you can't forget about the global impact of Hong Kong action cinema and the more recent resurgence of these wuxia films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Hero. Those movies brought the beauty and athleticism of Chinese martial arts to a huge international audience.
Yeah, they're like visual feasts. They really capture the imagination. But our sources also touch on some of the, less idealized aspects of the martial arts world, like the disagreements that exist within traditional CMA and the whole question of martial ethics and morality.
Yeah, like any tradition that's been around for a long time, especially one with so many different schools and lineages, there are bound to be disagreements about techniques, philosophies, training methods. It's inevitable.
So it's not all like harmony and brotherhood.
Well, there's definitely a strong emphasis on those things. But there's also rivalry, competition, sometimes even, let's just say not everyone plays nice.
Right, human nature being what it is. But this emphasis on martial morality, that seems to be a pretty consistent theme, doesn't it? This idea of humility, respect for your teachers and opponents, righteousness, trustworthiness.
Yeah, those virtues are still very important in a lot of traditional schools. They see martial arts as a way to cultivate not just physical skill, but also moral character. And speaking of global reach, we can't overlook the fact that CMA has spread all over the world. I mean, Tai Chi in particular has become super popular, mainly for its health and stress-reducing benefits.
Yeah, my grandma does Tai Chi every morning in the park. He swears by it.
There you go. It's good stuff. And it's interesting to look at how teaching traditions have differed, especially between, the historical practices in Asia and what we often see in the West today.
Yeah, what's the difference there?
Well, the traditional Asian model was very much based on this hierarchical teacher-student relationship.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of emphasis was placed on, rote memorization of forms, memorizing classical tech. There was a clear system of seniority among students.
It was very structured, very formal.
Extremely. And the testing for mastery could be really intense. You'd have to demonstrate skills that you don't always see emphasized in Western schools.
Interesting. So it's been adapted in certain ways for a Western audience.
Yeah, you could say that, but the core principles are still there. And ultimately, martial arts practice is something that anyone can benefit from, regardless of age or physical ability. It's good for your body, your mind, even your social life.
It's a holistic thing.
Exactly. And we even touched on the origins of the term martial arts itself. It actually has roots in both European and Asian traditions.
Really? I didn't know that.
And it's used in so many different contexts now. You have self-defense, obviously, but also military training, law enforcement. There are martial arts systems specifically designed for those purposes, like Defendu, for example.
Right. It's not just about, fighting in a tournament.
No, it's much broader than that. And the explosion of interest in the West, a lot of that was thanks to Bruce Lee, of course. He really brought it in stream.
Yeah, he's an icon. But that popularity also led to, some less credible schools popping up.
Unfortunately, yeah. You always get people trying to capitalize on a trend. But there are still a lot of genuine schools out there. And it's interesting to see how CMA has influenced other art forms, like hip-hop culture, for example.
Oh, yeah. Breakdancing has a lot of those same elements, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The dynamic movements, the emphasis on improvisation, the battles, the whole philosophy of self-expression. It's really fascinating to see those connections.
So it's like these ripples of influence that go far beyond just the martial arts world.
Exactly. It's a cultural force.
Okay, so wrapping things up here, we've really gone deep into this amazing world of Chinese martial art. We've explored its long and rich history, the incredible diversity of styles, styles, the deep philosophical underpinnings, the rigorous and varied training methods, how it evolved into a modern sport, and the profound and lasting impact it's had on Chinese culture, both within China and around the world.
And what might seem like, just a bunch of fighting techniques on the surface, it's really so much more than that. It's this intricate tapestry woven with history, philosophy, artistry, a deep understanding of the human body and mind.
It's a whole way of life for some people, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. We've been talking about all these core principles of Chinese martial art: perseverance, discipline, balance, the integration of mind and body. Think about how these principles might apply to other areas of your life, maybe even areas that seem completely unrelated to martial arts.
It's all about looking for those connections, finding those unexpected applications.
Right. Because these principles, they're not just about fighting, they're about life. Yeah. So as you go about your day, think about how you can cultivate that same spirit of discipline, focus, balance in everything you do. And who knows, maybe you'll find some surprising benefit. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.